Today, let's take a deeper dive into using pedals in the effects loop of the Boss Katana MK2 and the send and return settings in Tone Studio. And we'll also look at pedal order in relation to the built-in effects chain. First, let's explore the settings in Tone Studio, and I'm going to summarize them, and then I'll go into detail in just a moment. Let's get to it. So here you have the basic screenshot of what the send and return settings look like in Tone Studio. Over here, this is what the effects loop looks like on the back of your amp, unless you have a 50. And down here, these are the basic explanation of the settings from the user's manual. Now you can see position. It specifies the position at which the external effect unit is connecting with the Katana's effects chain. You got post amp and post reverb. In mode, you got series and parallel. Specifies whether the external effect unit is connected in a series or in parallel. The send level adjusts the volume of the output to the external device, and the return adjusts the volume of the input from the external device. Post amp versus post reverb. As you can see in the diagram, post amp places the effects loop after the amp EQ and before the effects, while the post reverb places the effects loop after the reverb, which is the last effects in the chain. By doing this, you can kind of customize the order of your effects chain and get some different tones. Series versus parallel. In series, it sends your guitar signal straight through the amp and effects loop as one single signal. Now in parallel, it doubles that signal, as you can see with this line here, and it goes straight through just like series, and then it takes another signal and branches it off through the effects loop, through your pedals that you're using, and then back in and out. So basically you got kind of a dry signal and a wet signal. You can kind of think of it that way, but it really isn't. Now the levels at 0 in series, if you have the levels at 0 in series, your signal's coming in and it's hitting this effects loop. And if your send level is at 0, it stops right here. It goes no further. Now if your levels are at 0 in parallel, you'll still have your dry signal going all the way through, but whether there's send and return, it'll stop in the effects loop and you won't hear it at all, but you'll still hear your dry signal. Now that we've covered the basic controls, let's take a look at some of the different ways you can set up your pedals using the effects loop and how they compare to the built-in effects chains. First, the most conventional way. I know this only shows the last version of Tone Studio effects chain, and now there's like 4 more. But the only difference is in the latter 4 chains that you can't see in this picture are the mod is before the booster. That's it. Like in chain 1 here, your signal's going from your guitar to your boosters into the amp, and then it branches off into the effects loop, and it hits your mods, your effects, and then your time-based delays. Now I just realized that this reverb should be over here and the delay should be over here. That's because I was going right to left last time when I was building this thing, and I realized I couldn't do it that way because the inputs are on the right side of the pedal. So I screwed up a little bit. So just imagine this is on this side, this side, and this side. Now let's say you want to throw a wah into the mix. Well, there you go. You generally want your wah pedals after your distortion pedals and before the amp. That way it's processing the signal from your guitar and your drives and processing it right through your wah, making it all wah, 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 and going into your amp. Everything else stays the same. It doesn't matter what chain you're on up here. That's generally how you want to run that crybaby or whatever. Next up, chain 2, also very common, but in this one you have some mods that you might place before the amp, usually things like an EQ or compressor, but that doesn't mean you can't throw a phaser or a tremolo in there if you want. But compressor and EQ pedals are usually used to process your guitar signal before it hits the amp. Now if I'm using a compressor or EQ, this is the configuration I prefer. And then right back to the loop, you got your FX and time-based effects. Now you're going to notice on all of these, the time-based effects are always at the end of the chain. Why is that? Well, it prevents your tone from sounding cluttered. Next up is chain 3, and in chain 3, similar to chain 2, only now you got your FX bumped before the amp, and your time bass are still after the amp. Lastly, have everything chain 3 has, but now you've thrown another delay in front of the amp, which there's a lot of debate whether you should have a delay before or after the EQ if you're going to use 2 delays. I say use 2 different delays and mix it up and play with the sound. In this case, we've got this analog delay before the amp EQ, but we got an EQ before the delay. And this is an analog, and then we got a digital one over here. So that covers the basics of how to use the send and return effects loop on the Boss Katana with your own pedals. And there is a ton of forums and debates out there on signal chain and pedal loader. And for the most part, what we have covered here is based on guidelines that are good to follow, but feel free to experiment with your own chains and tones and see where it takes you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.